Um, and good morning to those of you who are online. My name is Michael Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of the American Society of International Law. And it's my pleasure this morning to moderate this expert roundtable, Time and Distraction, A Strong Man's Ultimate Weapons, the 10th anniversary of the Caesar Report. I thought we might start simply by going around the room and doing some quick introductions. So if I may, I'll turn to you, Ina, and ask if you would introduce yourself to the audience.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Ina Linyova. I am an advisor for international operations of the Ukrainian Bar Association. And on behalf of the Bar Association, we personally would like to thank for the invitation to this event and for organization of this event. Because in the context of Ukraine, we are very engaged in accountability efforts at the national and international level. And unfortunately, we can relate to Syrian experience. And together, we are interested in brainstorming on how to strengthen the international mechanism of accountability for atrocity crimes. Thank you.
My name is Tina Al-Khersan. I'm the policy officer with the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. We're an organization that was originally imagined as a central repository for data and information on rights violations here within Syria. Now we've expanded to 7 programs. So thank you for the invitation and for having us here.
My name is Wes Rist. I'm the Atrocity Prevention Policy Advisor at the Bureau's Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State.
Hi, Beth Van Scott, U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, and is there the founding of SCHAC.
David Shepard, the former Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues, and now a professor of practice at Arizona State University in Washington, D.C.
Sean Murphy, I'm the Professor of International Law at George Washington University and former president of the American Society of International.
Raghuram Viada, Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and Director of the Master Center for Human Rights Studies.
My name is Sahil Lalji, and I'm a policy advisor in Ambassador von Stock's office, and I work on the NEA region.
Justine Stefanelli, Deputy Executive Director and Director of Publications and Research here at ASOL.
Hi, I'm Taylor Kilpatrick. I'm the Senior Programs Manager here at ASOL.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Crane. I was the Chief Prosecutor of the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone. I'm also the co-author of the Caesar Report. And I was also at SCHAC's founding as well. And now I'm with the Global Accountability.
Well, once again, good morning, everyone. I think that the purpose of today's expert roundtable is on this 10th anniversary to sort of take us back in time to the landing of the Caesar Report and what it meant at that moment, but also to reflect on the ways in which time, last decade or so, and distraction by other global developments has affected accountability in Syria. But before we jump into that part of the conversation, I thought it might be helpful for us to go back even a little bit further with our time machine to December of 2010, which I think many of us would consider the launch of what we called the Arab Spring at the time, right? The self-immolation of this young vendor in Tunisia who was selling fruit on the street and had run into trouble with the authorities, and as a statement of his frustration with the state of affairs in Tunisia, set himself on fire. And I wonder if I could call on some of our friends on this side of the room, maybe Radwan or Sean or Ambassador Sheffer, just to take us back to that moment of hope that came out of December 2010 and the Arab Spring that evolved over those first few years before we hit Syria.
Yeah, of course. I would start with this story. I left Syria in 2005. I came to the United States as Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. To write my book, Foreign Policy in Syria. But at that time, I was interested actually to study the transition, especially in Eastern Europe. And I traveled to Czech Republic. There's an organization still going called People in Need. And People in Need facilitate actually for us, a group of Syrians, to meet with some of the activists in Eastern Europe. And we met with Václav Havel at that time. And he told me a story that he never dreamed that what happened in Czechoslovakia would happen. And at that time, we thought 2005 will never happen in Syria. We have very grim authoritarian regime in Syria until exactly what the spark happened in Tunisia. Was very important moment. It galvanized the protest in Tunisia. There are too many theories why to start in Tunisia. I do believe in the modernization theory, Martin Lipset, that because Tunisia has a sizable middle class, 82% they own their houses. 91 at that time they had their own social media accounts, Facebook, and they are very westernized on that culture. That sizable middle class allowed them actually to protest quickly and early and to be able to overthrow the Tunisian regime because they do have professional army, did not intervene in that. And that, of course, moved into Egypt, where the Tahrir Square was the center focus at that time. They played very important role. And here the US, I think, played a role not in Tunisia, but in Egypt to convince the Mubarak regime to step down. But they don't go into orderly transition. They ask the army to to take over for almost a year off, and then moved into Libya, then in Syria. The difference in Syria and those other countries that the regime was determined at the beginning to adopt shoot-to-kill policy. And this is why I remember with Professor David Crane was very active on that. And the Human Rights Council was a debate at that time, 3 months after the Syrian uprising. Do we have special session on Syria and Bahrain at that time? Because Bahrain, they have protests, or only specifically in Syria, and the State Department at that time, very active on this. But 3 months in Bahrain and Syria, the number of people he killed in Bahrain at that time, 11, in Syria, 600. After just 3 months of the uprising. And that, of course, galvanized more the protest in Syria. And I can just to be brief that those 13 years of the uprising, it can be into 3 different phases. The first one were more peaceful protests. It can be until from March 2011 until almost at the mid of 2011. Key moment at that time, the killing of Riyad Matar, one of the most famous peaceful activists. The Syrian government kidnapped him, mutilated his all genitals and all of that, and they delivered his body to the families of small pieces of irons and TNT. Yeah. And it's my hometown, Daria, which they dropped almost 40,000 of these barrel bombs, left the city almost empty, from 300,000 inhabitants into 0 in 2013. And that's, of course, led to the use of the chemical weapons in Eastern Ghouta later on by the regime. And the US decided not to respond at that time with the red line. I think that was the end of the promising story to have a good ending to the Syrian uprising, to what we have right now. I believe we do have frozen conflict. And it became Syria stuck between Russia from one side and the United States from the other side. The regime has no capability to do any reform or accept anything. At the same time, the opposition in a week not to be able to overthrow or to do anything make the life of the Syrian better.
Thank you. No, thank you. I mean, I think we could add maybe Yemen also to that list of countries that saw a transition during that time, and there was a great deal of hope. I don't know if any others want to add reflections from thinking back about those early years of the Arab Spring, but go ahead, Sean.
Well, just to mention another aspect to the story as of that time period, the U.S. willingness or unwillingness to take action probably needs to be seen in light of what happened before that, which is a invasion of Afghanistan, an invasion of Iraq, a lengthy period of presence in both countries, expenditure of both blood and treasure in many ways by the United States and other countries that were working with the United States, and ultimately a fairly strong sentiment within the United States not to be so engaged abroad. You know, when President Obama is elected, it's partly on this idea of, you know, we should get out of these places and pull back. And a lot of mistakes were made of one kind or another by the US. We should not be the policemen of the world sort of thing. So I think that's happening in the period leading up to what Ron's referring to. And I think that's part of the story one needs to take account of as
Just
you then
to
go
add
forward.
something, yeah, and that's summarized by Philip Gordon, who actually was the chief responsible on the Arab Spring during the Obama, and now he's the senior policy advisor to Harris campaign. He summarized it to me and in his book that Obama discovered that full intervention in Iraq was disaster, half intervention in Libya was disaster, and no intervention in Syria was disaster. Every way you do it in the Middle East, disaster. But I think that's not justifying not to have policy options can help Syrian at that time and Yemeni and Libya.
The only other thing I would add is to your sort of second phase, I think it was really significant that we started with the Free Syrian Army, who carried with it the banner of revolution. And I think the United States and much of the international community gets very, it awakens the imagination when you have a revolution, right? We all want to be on the right side of revolution. But then we saw the rise of ISIL from Iraq. We saw different armed groups emerge on the opposition side, exactly, who were not adhering to the laws of war. And so it just complicated the battle space. We didn't have a good guy and a bad guy anymore. It just became this sort of metastasized, you called it a kaleidoscopic conflict, where you just have all these different actors. And then you had Russia coming in on the side of Assad and bolstering him at the moment when the FSA was maybe, you know, they had the regime on their back foot and the FSA was, you know, emergent. And that just complicated the story considerably. And then we got to the frozen conflict place where we're sort of stuck now.
Yeah, that's the way I remember it too, Beth. Just it sparked the public imagination. But then Americans
like all of the Arab Spring, right?
Exactly. But we really appreciate a simple narrative. And when a narrative gets too complex, we get a bit distracted.
Well, to that point, Michael, I might just add that
please.
Exactly to that point, I remember being asked in 2011, what do you think is the most significant development in world politics that lends to a positive view of the future? So I made the mistake, very naively, of saying, well, I thought the Arab Spring underway right now is the most positive development we can possibly imagine in international relations. I was dead wrong. Because within a year, it just started to collapse.
Yeah.
No, you're still right. I mean,
taking a longer view.
Exactly. The French Revolution, it took 70 years. We're still in the 30 years.
So, David, we're going to turn the time machine dial forward from 2010, just a few years, to the drop of this Caesar report. And I wonder if you could take us back to your personal experience of that moment in time and how that felt to you and how you experienced it personally.
Thank you,
As a starting
Michael.
point.
And my compliments to ASIL for hosting this a couple months ago. I went to them saying, you know, this is the 10th anniversary of the Caesar report. And I'm starting to see very parallel things happening in Syria and Ukraine. And I had been writing about time and distraction of Putin's ultimate weapons. And I saw the horror of Syria, and I've been very much involved since March of 2011 in Syria. And I saw that slip through our fingers. And then I'm now starting to see the same kind of indications, the distraction starting to happen related to Ukraine. So you and your important leadership team, we just sat around and said, let's use Syria as a case study and then fast forward to Ukraine and discuss the fact that is Ukraine starting to turn into another Syria, and time and distraction truly are Vladimir Putin's ultimate weapons, because he's hanging by his fingernails onto Ukraine, but in reality, he somewhat knows us better than we know ourselves. He realizes that democracies tend to move on because of events and time. And so that's kind of the underlying thing here, and the discussion that we're going to have now and into the future with potential future series related to all of this. Let's take you back. It was December, it was almost New Year's Eve. It was 30 December of 2013. I got a call from a solicitor in London. I happened to be having lunch with my wife and her father, and he introduced himself. And I said, we have a gentleman here you may know, Sir Desmond de Silva, who was my deputy and then eventually the prosecutor in the special court for Sierra Leone. And he said hello, and he said, we're putting together a team. We have the situation in Qatar of a former master sergeant in the Syrian army and he's just giving us 3 memory sticks, what appears to be high definition photos of some rather tragic things that are happening there. And we want you and Desmond to put together a team to go over and just assess to see what this is, whether it's valid, and whether we have something here, or whether it's some kind of psychological misinformation campaign by the rebels just to heighten the anger against Assad. So we put together a team of forensic pathologist, forensic photographer, and a pathologist. Our phase was to go over there, interview this sergeant. Our scientific team was going to go and take these photographs and determine whether they are valid and what they actually showed. You're all going to come back together, assess to see whether this is really valid or whether this is just a fool's errand. And then after that, study it, potentially write a report as to what we have if it's invalid. So, and the story is amazing. This young master sergeant who was a forensic photographer in the Syrian army, whose job was to take pictures of deceased individuals. Like any country has, they want to document a death and write a report and then forward it up to the chain of command to document the death. Was doing that in a hospital near a detention facility. And as the revolution progressed, he realized that the bodies were starting to pile out in the parking lot, and he had real trouble trying to keep up. And then when he saw friends coming across the table, he said, I have to do something. And so he started taking those photographs and making high definition copies and putting on a memory stick, where he smuggled them out in his shoe and met with a human rights group, part of the Syrian resistance, talked to them. They sat down, and being an old former senior intelligence officer, I find is brilliant. What they did is they devised a plan that they would announce that this sergeant would later become Caesar, tried to defect, and in the defection was shot and killed, and he's dead. And they even told his family that. And they moved him from Syria down through Jordan, down to Qatar. And so the Qatari foreign minister had this hot potato literally sitting in their lap going, oh my goodness, what do we have? Now, the footnote is they eventually moved the family out, and now they are settled. I don't know where Caesar is. So I met with Sir Desmond de Silva and Sir Geoffrey Nice and I and our scientific team. We started the process. I remember sitting across the table from young master sergeant, who I told Desmond, I said, we can't call him his real name. He's a dead man walking. So I said, why don't we just call him flippantly? I said, why don't we call him Caesar? And Desmond goes, we'll call him Caesar. And so there's the beginning of Caesar. And we sat down, 3 old prosecutors, just kind of assessing this guy, asking him questions, kind of cross-examination, good cop, bad cop kind of thing. While our scientific team is going through, we hadn't seen these photographs yet, but we knew that there were a lot of them. It turns out to be 54,000, and they ended up being showing the deaths, documented deaths of over 13,000 human beings. And so we all met for dinner that night, all of us, the whole team, the science team, the legal team, and we said, well, what have we got here? We all had concluded that Caesar was for real. Science team said, these are real photographs, and they are horrific. So they showed us, unfortunately, right after dinner, they were showing us pictures and it was like stomach churning, horror. So we went into phase 2 and we began to then capture and put together a structure for a report, which we drafted. And at the end of January, we published it, and it hit the world. It was sensational. It was in the front page of every newspaper, the lead story in every major TV program. I remember flying back from Doha when it was released, and when I landed, my phone exploded. And for 3 days, I was interviewed by 38 media outlets. My point is that we had a sensation, we had momentum, we had the world concerned, we had all of a sudden a lot of political cachet to do something about Syria, because you have to understand this is now 2014 and we're just limping along, the bodies are piling up, nothing is being done, and this is important. Tens of thousands of Syrians are fleeing to the level of millions of human beings moving into 360 degrees just to get out, many of them moving into Europe, which caused a ripple effect because there was a gag reflex by Europe. They, for humanitarian purposes, allowed them to come in by the millions, but then nationalistic politicians began to pick up on this and use that as a political advantage. And frankly, if you kind of consider this, this is the beginning of an inward look by many nations who were receiving Syrian refugees about, immigrants are coming into our country to, the standard drill where they are actually taking all our resources and taking our country away from us kind of thing.
And the Brexit happened at that time.
All kinds of things. So this was also kind of a ripple effect as well, is in some ways one could argue that it started a populism around the world where we see a retrenchment, not using the international community for international peace and security, but taking matters in their own hands. But that's real quickly the Caesar story. Caesar was removed and accepted by a country, and he lives in that country. I won't say where he is, and I don't know where physically he is in that country, but my last check was that he's fine with his family. But that took a brave step for him to smuggle those incredible photographs, which now we all see.
David, can I jump in for a minute to just ask, especially because there may be some younger people who watch this who were not as politically aware during that period. And at the risk of being sensationalist, I don't mean to provoke that, but those pictures told a story. There was a narrative. The people in those pictures were speaking to us, and they were telling us a story about what was happening in Syria. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a moment. What was happening?
Well, again, like good friend Radwan and Sean and David said, that the horror of Syria, and of course we were very much involved with, this is the beginning of the Global Accountability Network and the Syrian Accountability Project. The horror was beginning, but the world just wasn't reacting to it. I mean, they saw it. It was just another horror story in the Middle East. Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan were very much lots of smoke and dust in the air. But what happened with the photographs is it personalized, it humanized the atrocity, which you don't see a lot in the business that we've all been involved in. It was human beings, and of course I've been arguing that for decades about you have to think about the victims, not the process. This is all about victims. So we saw these victims, and they died in horrific ways. The average age was they were in their 20s and 30s, young, mainly men, about 90% men, who had been starved, tortured, and then eventually killed. And then what they did is they would write an identification number on their foreheads, and you'll see if you look at the photographs, you'll see numbers on their foreheads, which corresponded with a number on a piece of paper signed by Caesar saying that.
Two numbers.
What's that?
Two numbers. Number of the victims and number of the facility got killed.
Yes. Yes. And so we, to a prosecutor, this is called direct evidence. And it's the first direct evidence that we have coming out of Syria. I mean, we had thousands of videos and pictures and victim statements. We were very much involved in that. And that's where I first met Radwan and started working with SJAC. But it just wasn't causing the world to do anything. It was just data. And there was a lot of data on a lot of tragedies going around the world. So it didn't happen. But the Caesar report personalized Syria. And for about 2 years, we were in the paper. And then slowly but surely, they're not even in the paper now. And even though we're still very much involved, the US and other countries in portions of Syria, it looks like there's going to be impunity for there. It's a sad situation, but Syria has politically slipped off the table. Not that anybody doesn't care, it's just no longer political and important in a world that has time and distraction has moved on. And now we bumped into other places like Sudan, Ukraine, and other places that my two colleagues here know very much about, that Syria is now an afterthought. And so this is the concern. Syria, and now, oh my gosh, is it going to happen to Ukraine? And I don't want to diminish the other tragedies around the world as well, but I thought that this is a good way of which we collectively as friends and colleagues can honestly discuss where do we go from here.
David, so just a quick question. Were you a part of the effort to show the photos at the UN? Because that was really powerful, I thought. I don't know how that got set up.
The French were very much involved. They led this. They had the presidency of the Security Council at the time.
Okay, right.
Yes, and so we were working with them, and I was invited along with Stuart Hamilton, Dr. Stuart Hamilton, who was our forensic pathologist, to brief the Security Council in March of 2014. The hope was that we would have enough push to refer Syria to the ICC. That was really the motive of the French.
And you did have a Security Council resolution, but Russia and China.
Yes.
Which we joined, remarkably.
No, indeed. And Samantha Power was the ambassador at the time. And so I remember, amazingly, they had a press conference set up right next door. Again, the press office is right there. We were going to hold this briefing for an hour, and then we were going to hold the press conference. Again, this is great theater for us to try to move an atrocity into the public domain, putting pressure on politicians to do something. And so I remember I had the photographs behind me, and I was briefing, talking about the international crime. I told them about how we did it, and the international crimes, and then I had Dr. Stuart Hamilton do the science, just go through and say, this guy was killed because of this guy. And I mean, the Security Council was just pale. And we finished. And then for the next 2 hours, so the whole event took 3 hours, which is extraordinary. The representatives, and all of the major representatives were there. It wasn't their second secretaries or whatever, their legal advisors. It was the ambassadors just peppered us with questions. Russia was particularly cross-examining me and Stuart, but the point is we really made our point, and then we went next door, and the world was there, and so it continued that momentum. But that's my cautionary tale here to all of us and to our listeners is I thought we'd finally done it. Of course, as you say, Radwan, China and Russia vetoed the resolution, but it was the first attempt to do something like that. And sadly, it's never been done since, but it certainly was an attempt by the French with the backing of the other permanent members other than Russia to push maybe a resolution to do something about Syria. And that was really, I think in my mind, the last official kind of world attempt, Beth, if I remember correctly, that actually was going to do something about Syria. And then as you correctly point out, Rodman, there are the 3 phases, and it just began to fade into the time. And so, the horror of over 500,000 human beings being destroyed and tens of millions of refugees being affected will pass into time without any real accountability. And that's my concern, but also my concern is our colleagues in the Ukraine as well. Because, the bright red thread of atrocity accountability is politics. It's not law. It's a political decision to do something, not a legal decision.
Yeah, for me, David, that raises an important question, and maybe I'll toss it out to Ambassador Sheffer and Ambassador Van Schaak and anybody else that wants to weigh in from Beth's team. Or so does evidence matter really at the end of the day? And how much evidence do you need? I mean, David has spoken to this idea of having this enormous cache of direct evidence. When we hosted the Ukrainian Prosecutor General last fall, he had reported to us that he had, if I remember right, 500 terabytes of evidence, of digital evidence at that point in time that had been collected in Ukraine. Recently, the international community has stood up a number of mechanisms for collecting evidence of various atrocities. There's some talk about maybe creating a more permanent international institution for the collection of evidence. But does the collection of evidence sometimes become a substitute for real accountability and the political will that we need to move the ball forward? So I'd be interested to hear what David, Beth, and others have to say about that.
I think I would answer your question by saying that ultimately, the evidence, of course, matters. In fact, it makes or breaks the case, but the case could take 15 to 20 years before it reaches a judicial determination. And that is the importance of all of the evidence that's being collected on Syria, Ukraine, etc. If you take the long view, then the evidence is absolutely critical. But I think in the short-term view, it's very difficult to get that political support to generate the momentum for the evidence to reach the courtroom quickly. And that's what we're experiencing time and time again. Interestingly, on the Syria vote for the Security Council that Russia and China vetoed, isn't it interesting that that was in 2014, right? Yeah, 2014. And we had just started to come out. In fact, we were still sort of in the middle of dealing with the African complaint that the ICC was not dealing with non-African situations.
Yeah, good point.
And here we have a classic example of where it could have been a non-African situation reaching the ICC with the support of the United States, the Europeans, etc. And yet Africa, I don't know if they lobbied Russia and China to try to refer it or not, but it was an example of how the ICC has that capability, but of course it requires a political decision to untrigger that, or to trigger that opportunity for the ICC to more quickly get into the evidence and adjudicate it. But we still have this dilemma in so many situations where I do strongly believe in supporting the collection of evidence, even if it means many, many years later, finally being able to adjudicate them, perhaps against elderly defendants, but nonetheless, if only for history, that evidence is there.
Well, you make a good example of the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia, you know, basically 25 years later did something.
Yes.
So there is, was not a perfect event, but there's even some kind of historical precedent in that way too.
And it's interesting in Cambodia how today the evidence bank of the now ended extraordinary chambers and courts of Cambodia, the archives of that evidence have become a learning tool for generations of Cambodians, which are taking advantage of it. Just as the Nuremberg archives are a continuous educational process for those who want to understand the Holocaust. So historically, it's absolutely imperative, but judicially, finding the exact mechanism to adjudicate it was always the problem.
No, I agree. I mean, there's no question that sometimes all we can do is documentation, and our office funds that. The Human Rights Bureau will fund that, and now we have these new international mechanisms that have sort of stepped in, either as kind of clearinghouses or consolidators, or doing their own investigations. But I think there is a recognition that it's a necessary but not sufficient element of accountability. You can't have good accountability or even broader transitional justice responses if you don't have a better understanding of what happened, ultimately, causes, consequences, etc. And that cache of information can be used for multiple different purposes: individual criminal accountability, truth-telling, vetting, lustration of bad actors if there's a new regime being stood up, all of that. So we see it as an investment in justice broadly defined, and that's why we fund it. But there's no question that sometimes, at a minimum, that's all we can do politically. So we'll say, oh, we're just going to fund up. We need to understand what's going on. It'll inform policy decisions, all of that. often looking ahead though to some future justice effort. And then this ability to have a breakthrough moment like the Caesar photos were, where you almost get the political will to like go to the next step, but it didn't happen in this particular case, but.
Yeah.
There's an element here where the evidence is, as the ambassador was just saying, it's more than just what we in it. That are trying to recover from that, are trying to create a post-conflict, a post-setting. We're not in that space, obviously, in Syria yet, but that's going to come at some point. And the importance of that information, of that storytelling of the individuals who experience that being available to them. We have seen governments trying to erase that record, trying to erase that history, regardless of whether or not we get to a international or domestic tribunal, just to say, you're wrong, that didn't happen. And the ability of that to be present for restorative justice, for reparative justice, for non-Western ideals of justice is really critical. And in my work, we see this especially on, trying to break these cycles of reperpetration, of impunity. The number one risk factor of a country of experiencing an atrocity is a previous atrocity that has not been addressed. And so collection of evidence that can be utilized by the community from which it came is a really important part of that. And I think we're having these conversations around the proposed standing international investigative mechanism around making sure that that information is not locked behind what a prosecutor would say is, we've got to preserve this, we don't want to tip our hat on what we know, et cetera. But if that evidence is being provided by a community that is the one putting themselves at risk to share that, they need to have the right to be able to do with that evidence and that information what they want to do. And so there's a tension there. Like, there's not an easy solution on what do you do with this, but making sure that the communities that this come from can make use of this going forward in ways that they feel is important, absolutely critical.
There's a sub-political theme of evidence and politicians. Politicians and diplomats tend to think that you've got terabytes of videos, pictures, and victim witness statements, what have you, to the tune of, it's a tsunami of information, but it's just information. And just putting on my old prosecutor hat, it's just that. It's not evidence. And so in some cases now, it just shows how quickly this is morphed into the information age and social media. When I was in Sierra Leone, we were doing investigations the old-fashioned way. Investigators going up country. This is 2002 to 2005. To show you, I didn't even have a laptop because they weren't invented yet. And so we had investigators with yellow pads, pencils, going up country, interviewing people about what happened here. There were we did have photographs. The BBC had filmed until they were thrown out, and all of their, they moved and there were no news, but we did have some video evidence. But in reality, it was just good old fashioned investigations. Fast forward within just 5 years, and even with Syria, we had terabytes of information, petabytes of data coming in. And when we were starting our process of investigating, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, because, telling the people that were working with me, saying that we have to turn this into evidence. And hence what we created the IIIM, because we had 50, 60 NGOs going out, stepping all over the crime scene and screwing everything up. And so going to the UN and saying, look, we need to have something better than this. We need to have professionals start gathering evidence, as we see, and turning it into something that someday a domestic, regional, or international prosecutor can take and actually prove a case. So it's not a blessing to have social media and the internet and all of that anymore. In fact, it's actually in some ways a bigger challenge to create a case with real evidence, because it's still, the rules of evidence haven't changed. It hasn't changed. And we're trying to morph it into going back and, and metadata and all of the things that need to be done but I still have to show that this took place on this particular event, and this person either took the video, or this is a reasonable representation of that video, et cetera, so that the court's looking at it going, this isn't relevant, or you haven't proved the foundation, and yet you've got tens of millions of stuff that showed what happened, but you still have to go through that incredible strain of really the rules of procedure and evidence to actually get it physically into court to prove your case. So that's also a challenge. And maybe another series, part of our series is just that.
Can I?
I'm sorry. If I could just ask you to pause for 1 minute, Radwan. I wanted to turn for a moment to Tina, if I could, just to react to what Wes said about the value of evidence from, historical, political, sociological, psychological value of evidence. Do you think it will have those values for the people of Syria going forward?
Yeah, I was actually just gonna say, I think it's a question of narrative and who controls the narrative. And so I think when you have evidence, you're able to establish facts and collect all of the information. And I think what the Caesar photos were able to do was pierce through this shroud of secrecy that the regime had the Assad government had put forth. And when you were able to kind of get to the core of the government and uncover some of the most egregious rights violations, that's what shocked the conscience of the people. Because for so long that had been, even despite the rights violations that we had seen up until that point, hidden in secrecy, really. And so when you have evidence, I think when you're talking about time as an ultimate weapon, time can have physical impacts on evidence. We know it can be destroyed, but we also know that individuals who have experienced trauma, that can also impact information. Trauma has a very real impact on memory recall, for example. And so just being able to have a repository of information, like we have our documentation tool, Bayonat, that we've created to sift through evidence, to look for trends, to analyze the information. I think then you're allowing survivors and communities to be able to control the narrative, which in authoritarian regimes, it's often not an option. And so I think that the question of preservation is very important. And like we've seen in Cambodia and other contexts, it's not a short-term gain in many contexts. It's decades, sometimes centuries. And I think there has to be hope placed in that, as well as also the short-term mechanisms. So
I'll go to Radwan and David and then T-Line, if that's okay.
I just need to add here the victim perspective to the Caesar report, which I think it's really important. Because I myself recognize 5 of my high school friends who actually I saw there for faith, and 2 of my high school teachers. It was shocking to me actually to see the photos there on the laptop. And that sparked debate among the Syrians at that time. Should put the photos for every family to recognize their beloved one, or we have to preserve their rights of privacy and not to do that. But then how we actually tell them that story, because the regime never outreach to the families to. Most of the victims of the Caesar are actually in mass graves in Najaf. Najaf is a very military cemetery under the supervision of the 4th battalion, which is controlled by Al-Asaad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad. I would say this is very important because every family, they saw these 2 numbers. Those 2 numbers, when I was in Syria, I served as a physician in the Mazza hospital. Every military institutions, they give them number for secrecy. And the Mazza hospital called 601. Those facility goes back to the French mandate. It's no way you consider them as a hospital. It's like a rehab. And most of the victims actually also been tortured on 251, which they call the security branch. That's the most notorious one who was responsible, by the way, on the Palestinians to overthrow the Palestinian Syrians, because large number of the Caesar photos also about the Palestinians. But the second point I need, it's of course galvanize the Syrians, they know that, but they never see the horror in photos, on pictures, and their beloved one on the most of them actually, because there is no food at that time. By hunger, they died. But at the same time, exactly when we reach the Security Council with all these evidences and nothing happened, that's demoralized most of the public Syrians. That's the international community is abandoning us. Everyone at that time actually asked me the question, if they have everything, what next they need? They have high expectation of that the Caesar can report, can do something for them to help them at that time, but nothing happened. And I think that's justified one of the radical groups, and Nusra and ISIS, to see that the West, your ally, has abandoned you, you have nothing to do. And that's more people start joining, and Nusra and others, they see there is no political actions can save what left. And the last point, I think was very important still now when see the Caesar report as legislation at the Congress. It gave us a point of hope that despite of Syrian is deadlocked on international law and ICC and others, but we find different maneuvers. Very powerful legislation on the Caesar, and the opposition use it all the time. And of course, Republicans and Democrats come to that to support it. I think this is also, it can tell us about Ukraine. I know that the main case for the ICC in Ukraine was the children abduction. But I think the Ukrainian, they have to do more job on doing exactly what the Caesar, to put photos on that, more outreach. Because when I travel to Africa, most of the Middle East, they never hear the story about the hero of the abduction of the Ukrainian children. I think, but everyone hear about Caesar and the photos. I think if our Ukrainian friends, they do more to put actually photo to the case, personalize the story, it can help them actually to get more support in their fight against the Russians.
David, you wanted to intervene.
Michael, just a small point for the record of this discussion. Bear in mind that I think one of the huge importance for the Caesar report is that these are essentially crimes against humanity for which there is no statute of limitations, so that if ultimately there can be a judicial body that can examine this evidence at the international level, they will not be restricted in their ability to enter this as evidence other than defense arguments about authenticity, etc. But also you might just describe, if anyone here knows, I think there have been one or two or more universal jurisdiction cases in Europe where the Caesar photos have been used.
Yeah.
That might be interesting to bring in to the discussion. And the final thing I just want to mention is that since the Caesar photos, there has been now developed the Eyewitness to Atrocities program, which does provide a very secure way to record evidence of this character, get it into a lockbox that can then be used in a courtroom without successfully challenging it by defense counsel for its authenticity. It wasn't available for the Caesar photos, but that is also a vehicle now that can assure the authenticity of that evidence.
I'm going to turn to Ina and then Ambassador Van Schaak and give Sean a heads up on crimes against humanity. We're going to take advantage of your presence here to ask you a couple of questions.
Thank you. I just wanted to agree with Ambassador Sheffer because collection of evidence is of extreme importance in any case. And in Ukraine, we see that we still struggle with this process. Despite terabytes of information that is available, not all information is admissible as evidence. It's not up to the standard. This is exactly why we advocate for the usage of IT technology that automatically verifies metadata, does not require human involvement in processing this information, and can stand years and decades. We also have, unfortunately, a big issue with collecting witness testimonies, especially abroad. There's still no good system of cooperation between the countries where all the Ukrainian refugees who reside abroad would be questioned, interviewed, and afforded a procedural status for their testimony being used as evidence. I think in the case of Ukraine, because of this, it's of utmost importance that we develop a good database of evidence, and we know that under Eurojust, there is an IT system that has been developed and I think is being piloted at the moment. Hopefully it's as efficient as, for example, the IT systems that are used by American intelligence services. We all know about how successful investigation of Al-Qaeda and finding of bin Laden was because of this database that was able to analyze all the information ever received on the subject and find pieces of evidence. So hopefully something like this can be established in Ukraine. But I also like to feed back to the accountability effort. It's very important that always there's accountability that follows evidence collection. And ultimately, it's not a debate between justice and peace. We see in multiple research in countries, transitional justice countries, victims and survivors agree that peace, lasting peace meaningful peace cannot be possible without accountability. And this is exactly what we're looking for in case of Ukraine, as Ambassador Sheffer brilliantly noted. We need, if we talk about specific things that can be done by the international community, in particular, in the case of Ukraine, it's establishment of the International Tribunal for prosecution of the case of a crime of aggression committed against Ukraine and universal jurisdiction investigations that can shed a lot of light, attract a lot of attention of the world to these particular cases.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to your intervention. I hope you can also talk a bit about some of the struggles in the evidence collection in Ukraine, because you're very close to that.
No, I was just gonna ping off, I think it was your point that somebody's your point about the UJ cases. A couple of them have used, and my understanding is, however, if you look at the broad swath of those cases, most of them are not against regime figures because those guys have not traveled, right?
Yeah.
So some are happening in absentia, like in France, and that is to be, celebrated. But a lot of them are low-level opposition figures, or they're ISIL members, or they're foreign terrorist fighters who have returned to their, state of nationality. So, in terms of sort of impunity and regime figures, it's still not a great story. Where I think the Caesar photos will be incredibly valuable is the Dutch-Canadian case under the Torture Convention before the International Court of Justice, which is adjudicating state responsibility. So all the stuff that you described in terms of the system and the crimes, the meeting of crimes against humanity, gravity threshold, widespread, systematic, is going to be really relevant to show that there was a policy in place to torture, disappear, unlawfully detained, and extrajudicially execute members of opposition forces or individuals. I don't know to what extent the Dutch and Canada have the raw data. I imagine they do at this point, but I don't know if David can shed some light on that.
I'm aware of what's going on, not specifically in the meetings and stuff.
Yeah.
I do know that is going to be a definitive cornerstone to all of this, and you make an excellent point of this. And yeah, you're right. Are we doing anything? Yes, it's the domestic systems that are doing something in some form of accountability, low-level individuals, colonels who've turned into refugees and slipped into Germany and now all of a sudden got caught and now they're being prosecuted. And so kudos to the European countries that are really making an effort to count. But the piece of regional and international accountability where we have to go to the source of the pain and suffering, that's still the challenge at many levels. But you make a good point on this, is that where that case goes is going to be definitive, because it'll be a cornerstone. It'll actually potentially hold Assad somewhat accountable in a formal way that we all know, but in a way that then sends a signal, because David Sheffer is right. There is no statute of limitations. Someday, international justice is 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But as long as we lean forward, we're going to eventually get there. And so this is important.
And it could be the first time, I think, I don't know, the real public international lawyers may correct me, but I think, I mean, it would be the court adjudicating potentially reparations, not to go to Canada or the Netherlands for having been harmed, but they're acting erga omnes on behalf of all of the signatories. So theoretically, reparations should go to victims and survivors, but like, I don't think we have a mechanism to distribute that. And so it'll be a whole new era, I think. And then we've seen the Gambia's case on behalf of Rohingya against Myanmar, and you know, all of these other cases coming forward. And it was the basis of that first case that adjudicated that there was standing on behalf of the Netherlands and Canada, which is really an important ruling.
Yeah, no, these erga omnes cases are really intriguing to see where that may lead us. But that might be a good segue to Sean as well. So when we think of accountability, we're thinking of the tribunals, the ICC, international accountability. But there's a lot of movement now on this Crimes Against Humanity treaty, especially this month. I think we might be taking a step forward, I hope anyway. And in what respects do you think, if we can get that treaty over the line, it will open up new channels of accountability that can be explored?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that the International Law Commission developed a series of draft articles for what could be a new convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. Completed the work in 2019, sent it to New York. It's been discussed, debated over the past few years. The pandemic sort of interfered a bit with that. But we're now in a position where a group of states have put forward a draft resolution that's going to be debated and hopefully voted on this fall, that would call for the convening of diplomatic conference under UN auspices that would move forward with negotiating the specifics of what that convention would look like, and then adopting it and putting it forward for ratifications and eventually accessions. What does it do? As you were suggesting, Michael, it doesn't focus on international tribunals. Instead, the idea is to build up national laws and jurisdiction to go after persons for crimes against humanity. And that seems important because if you look around the world, half of the countries of the world have no national law on crimes against humanity, including the one we're sitting in right now. So that if an alleged offender turns up in most countries, there's no ability to prosecute them for crimes against humanity. There may be ability to get them for something else. So we do have a criminal law in the United States that implements the Torture Convention that would allow for prosecution of that nature here, but not for crimes against humanity. And to some extent, that's important when we're thinking about things like leadership crimes, because the whole point in crimes against humanity is a widespread or systematic attack within a sort of structure that would allow you to go after certain persons for that crime, which things like a crime of torture is less obvious. You know, there may be some aiding and abetting aspects to it, but it's a little bit different in nature. So the idea is get states to adopt a crimes against humanity statute that would largely replicate the ICC Rome Statute's definition, and get them to adopt statutes that allow them to exercise jurisdiction over not just their own nationals or crimes in their own territory, but over crimes abroad that the offender turns up in your territory. So it's sort of a classic, torture type convention, but it's crimes against humanity instead. We're talking a lot about documentation and evidence. This treaty would include provisions on mutual legal assistance, obligating states when they receive a request from another state to produce information that they have, would have provisions on extradition. If an offender turns up somewhere, you must either submit the matter to prosecution in your own territory or extradite the person. So in terms of bringing about accountability, the idea is to try to harness the national criminal law systems that are already in place with all of their infrastructure to try to address the kinds of problems we're talking about today. We'll see what the General Assembly does, right? It's not a given that they'll adopt this resolution that launches the negotiations. There are many states that support it. There are some that do not. And it's going to be a political, back and forth to see if they can get to a point where the resolution get adopted. And even then, you got to have the negotiation. You got to get the treaty adopted. And ratified and implemented, it's a long road. But it could be the next stage in a process of accountability of the kind we're talking about.
Excellent. Sahil?
Yeah, if I can make one statement and then have a question for the lawyers in the room. The first statement is something that I recently learned about the consequences of this sort of impunity gap that's happened over time, particularly for the Assad regime when people come into national jurisdictions within Europe, for example. 11 years have passed, and a lot of these victim communities often are desperate to see action and accountability. And so often what happens is war crime units will find someone who potentially is a part of the regime. They'll bring in members of the community, and people will actually over exaggerate testimony or provide false testimony because there's a sheer notion of desperation for accountability. And so that's often a consequence that I think can be under considered. That's something that our office recently learned from a conversation with SJAC working in France, for example. So this could also undermine this whole ecosystem of accountability, where then the war crime units or investigators, when they're cross-referencing, that can create this greater notion of distrust. So I think that's something we should also consider over time. And then secondly, I wanted to ask about crimes against humanity domestically here within the United States. I know we seek to protect our own troops in the crimes that we've also committed in different parts of the world, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan and other places. So I'm kind of wondering, what are sort of the legal and political dynamics that might make it challenging for us to fully implement something like that here within the US if a treaty like that were to be passed?
Well, on your first point, one thing that I thought was very interesting when the Caesar report came out was how you assessed the credibility of Caesar. And one aspect of that was he wasn't making claims. I myself saw things, that he could have done. And because he was being more reserved in his approach, that led some credence to the idea that he was being credible. And that, I think, is
very dispassionate.
Yeah, interesting.
This is what happened.
Right, very interesting. In terms of your other question, sure. I mean, any country, including the United States, seems to be thinking about it's not just the other who might get caught up in this regime, but our own forces. Now, I like to think that the U.S. trains its military to follow the laws of war and to not commit torture, crimes against humanity, and so on. That doesn't mean that things don't happen, and things have happened, like at Abu Ghraib or at Guantanamo or whatever. I think the United States has learned from those experiences, those are not good things to do. And when you look at what's now on the books in terms of US law, like the McCain Amendment, you must treat them, not just don't torture them, but no cruel or inhumane treatment is permitted either, right? So are there going to be deviations? Of course. But the idea in part is, if you do in fact uphold these rules vis-a-vis your own forces, you're not going to have to worry about the ICC, you're not going to have to worry about foreign prosecutions because you're taking care of it yourself. But yeah, if you don't take care of it yourself, there is going to be an issue. So don't commit violations.
Reading the consensus in the room, I'm coming to the conclusion that evidence does matter. Right? I think we all agree on that. But we've also used this word someday a few times, and since time itself is one of the dimensions that we're looking at today, how important is it to accountability that we have accountability sooner rather than later? I was recently in Armenia and talking with one of our friends, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, and he has this interesting theory about how, if we wait long enough for a dictator, sooner or later they fall to corruption, right? Like the corruption is the thing that undermines their political support. When that's revealed to the local population, they lose political support, and then suddenly they become available to the international criminal justice system. So are we relegated to trying only octogenarians? I mean, do we really have to wait that long to bring them into the docket? And how does that matter? I also think specifically of cases like the abducted children in Ukraine. And there's a qualitative difference between getting your daughter back when she's 7 and getting her back when she's 17. So some of these things simply can't wait. So I wanted to, maybe I'll turn to Ina and then Wes on that, or whatever else you'd like to say. But just this issue of time and the dimension of time with respect to accountability.
Thank you. No, I agree that in certain cases, and it is exactly the case of children, justice cannot wait, and we need to take action now, and this action would be universal jurisdiction. We see, unfortunately, as in Argentina, that there will be no way to trace these children in years to come unless there's an effective system of DNA testing, which probably again might not happen in case of Russia. However, when it comes to high level military and political leadership liability, even if it's octogenarians and even it's not immediate, it is very important to make sure that justice is served. And it's very important, I think, to make a signal right now that justice will be served. For example, establishment of the tribunal right now, showing that regardless of time, distraction, accountability will happen. And speaking about universal jurisdiction and also Convention on Crimes Against Humanity, hopefully it happens very soon, but also we would like to see more, I want to say, peer pressure at the international level, encouraging countries to apply things at the national level. Because even if we look at universal jurisdiction, a number of countries reverted their legislation. Look at Switzerland, Spain. They actually went back from pure universal jurisdiction to more of a passive personality jurisdiction, which at the international level does not send the signal that we want to send in this case. So hopefully there is a system of cooperation in the place that actually encourages such accountability actions.
Something that I'll just add to that is I was in New York last week for the Clinton Global Initiative and had an extended meeting with friends from Save Ukraine. And one thing I had not taken note of, maybe others in the room know this, but my understanding is that one of the techniques that the Russians are doing is they're giving new names to these children.
Yep.
They're supplying them with new birth certificates with different dates of birth and essentially masking their identity and transforming them into different people in many ways. So I was really surprised to hear that. I didn't know that that was going on. I know, Wes, you had your card up in Ambassador 2. There's a bit of a ranking problem here. So I don't know if you want to go for your like, let's go for us. Okay, yeah, all friends. All right, please, Wes, go ahead.
I think the time and frankly the distraction part of this, that the underlying principle of this conversation comes up here. As someone who has to constantly fight my own brain for distraction, and I know very much that the answer is not just yelling at yourself, pay attention. There's got to be a more intentional engagement on this. And the Caesar report was actually an interesting example because at the time, working for ASO, I was traveling the country, speaking to law schools and law students about international law careers. But then I would also set up, because we had the 100 Ways International Law Affects Your Life pamphlet that we had done. I would set up meetings at community centers, at community colleges, at religious institutions to talk about international law and you. And it was just a community outreach kind of thing that we did. And depending on when it was, what people asked questions about was very driven by current events. But there was a solid 18 months where I was asked about the Caesar report in Ohio, in Florida, in Texas, in Nevada, like consistently, we saw these things on the news. What is happening? What is the international system doing about this? We're horrified by this. We're paying attention. What are you going to do? And I think in my own experience, Syria was the example where it became more and more difficult to argue that the international law system was actually addressing the problem, was doing something. But there was that level of engagement, of interest. We saw this in the early 2000s in Darfur. We've seen this on Ukraine. We've seen this on Israel, Gaza, of attention from individuals. And I think that the point I wanted to make is that we talk about accountability, and especially in this place, in this room, we equate that with criminal accountability. But accountability is political as well. Like justice and accountability does not happen only in a courtroom. And so using this information in a way where, yes, the accountability in a courtroom may take decades. We may only try Iljuk when he's in his 80s and we don't get him, or Milosevic dies in the middle of the prosecution. But that's not the only way that accountability can be sought. Omar al-Bashir never left his country for a very long period of time after the ICC indictment. Still led to serious problems in Sudan that we're experiencing now today, but he was not a world-traveling world leader that could just go anywhere that he wanted. There were consequences that accrued there. And so seeing the time and attention be turned into political will, I think requires that we that work on international law or international relations at this level actually start talking to people who care about this because they're good people and it matters to them that others are being harmed around the world, and turning that into political action, advocacy, engagement in a way that can change political discussions. I know there's a worry about isolationism in America specifically, but I can say, like, I've never had more of my friends who aren't in international law or politics asking me about foreign policy than now. Like constant thread chains of like, I just saw this, here's a Post article, here's a Times article, what about this, what do I need to know about? The moment is right for people to be engaged on this, but it requires, I think, a turning from looking at just the halls of power and looking at a community hall and saying, you can do something about this.
That's great, Les.
I wasn't going to talk about this, but let me just give a really concrete example of that. When I first started in government as deputy, it was right around the time that Comey 2012 video came out, which was like completely inaccurate and really problematic in many ways. But there were kids marching in the street, like holding these signs, and then they would talk to their parents, who would then call their members of Congress, who would then call my office and say, who's this guy Coney and what are we doing about it? And then it gave rise to the Northern Uganda Reconstruction Act. We had special forces on the ground. I mean, that created a political momentum to actually do something. And so I totally agree that we've never in the United States, I don't think, built a proper group of constituents who really care about international justice. So when our members of Congress are contemplating sanctioning the ICC, those members are not getting phone calls from Cleveland or Kansas City saying, wait, what are you doing? Why don't we, sanction international justice? We may disagree with them, but that doesn't seem like an appropriate response. So I think that's been a failure, frankly, of the human rights community, that we haven't had that kind of grassroots outreach. What I was going to make, I wanted to just bring everyone's attention to a new initiative around accountability in Syria. It's very focused. At the present, it's NGO driven, but it's cross-regional in terms of states' involvement, and that's a new working group on chemical weapons. The idea being that this is a sort of taboo that has been broken, at least in the US's count 50 times in Syria, with the regime against its own people, plus ISIL has not commandeered chemical weapons of the regime, but rather has an indigenous ability to produce them. The scientists at OPCW have looked at the various types of weapons used, and they're not the same. And so that's terrifying, obviously. So the inspiration was we needed a standalone tribunal to adjudicate chemical weapon use in Syria, maybe broader chemical weapon use elsewhere, because there's allegations in Ukraine, there's allegations in Burma that chemical agents have been used. A lot of the Western states are really skeptical of the idea of a standalone tribunal for the same reason that there's been some skepticism about other standalone tribunals, probably much to your chagrin, but that's the reality. But there also is an effort to think more broadly about like how to strengthen national systems. And this is something I want to toss to the academics in the room. Could you imagine thinking about chemical weapon use as a form of torture? Because the idea is to cause maximum suffering. This is not trench warfare in World War I, which is why we developed chemical weapons in the first place, but rather to terrorize the civilians by having them see people die or suffer in horrific ways. And many chemical weapons don't end up killing the person. They're just making that person suffer horribly, and everyone around them suffer and carry the psychological burden. So I had a student that wrote a really good paper. I sent it to you this morning, Sahil. She didn't quite get it right, but she got us close to thinking about doing that. Some of the definitions, like in the ICC, have a custodial or a control element to it, which like distant chemical weapon use from a barrel bomb, let's say, like maybe wouldn't satisfy. But as I remember correctly, the treaty doesn't. So anyway, like somebody needs to write the definitive paper and hand it to the Canadians and the Dutch.
Yeah.
And say, while you're adjudicating this matter and the industrial grade torture in torture centers around Syria, could you not also make this allegation as well? And that might be an outlet to bring chemical weapon use to the fore and advance our thinking on that.
Interesting.
And you mentioned the word quote tribunal. You know,
Yeah.
the world hates the word tribunal.
I know.
Because they don't like to form them. Could you call it a commission and do the same thing?
Really?
I mean,
Yeah,
at the
maybe.
point,
Yeah.
I know that sounds, I'm just looking at it from a very
I
practical
mean, we'll
point
take
of
that
view.
in, right, as a possible,
Because
yeah.
commission has a different implication and people tend to like to join commissions because it looks politically good to be a part of the commission,
Yeah,
but you're doing the same thing.
yeah,
I mean, that's the first time hearing this. It's a great idea because, you know, we have the Chemical Weapons Convention, which per se says that use of chemicals in any form of
Yeah.
belligerency is
the norm is
illegal.
there.
And it's a war crime if it's an actual war conflict. The challenge is when a regime uses chemicals just to terrorize its own population, that is a crime against humanity. I probably could argue enough that it's another inhumane act, but nobody in this quote commission, if I'm pushing it now, could actually study that as well, because we are seeing in these dirty little wars of the 21st century, the seepage of, for almost 100 years, we haven't used chemical weapons in a large way since World War I. It has happened, but it's really locked down in some ways, the use of that terrible, and of course the bacteriological aspect of that as well. So it's more than just chemicals, it's bacteriological and other kinds of viruses and things that could also creep up. So anyway,
It's a great idea because I think where the states that are skeptical of standalone tribunals that don't have the backing of the UN or the Security Council, or even a cross-regional 124 state ratifications, is the jurisdictional basis. Like, what is the power by which that tribunal exercises coercive powers against an individual, or is it like an unlawful confinement? If you hold somebody and you don't, like, what is the basis for that? And so if it's, I don't want to say only a commission, but if it's a commission that's a fact-finding commission that can ascribe responsibility, but there's no coercive power behind it, it could still be incredibly valuable.
well, it also have an educational part of it, it could be an awareness part of it,
And it could
also.
feed into national.
Well, that was my point.
Yeah.
You know, at the international,
It could work.
you're not going to get a national tribunal on chemical weapons. I just don't see that practically happening. Sounds good,
Yeah.
but a commission can sit down and work with regional organizations as well as national organizations just to assist and provide experts and provide training on how to prosecute crimes against humanity.
It's very technical, that chemical weapons,
Precisely.
right? So put some scientists on,
Yeah.
like you did with your cross-disciplinary.
Yeah, you have to
Caesar
do that.
report, too.
Yeah, exactly. So that, that's just a thought. I mean,
No, it's really interesting. And I was going to ask, when's the last time someone at this table actually read the Chemical Weapons Treaty, right? Like, it's one we maybe need to dust off a little bit, especially in this norm-breaking era.
And we don't have, as I remember correctly, we don't have proper present in jurisdiction over breaches. We could charge somebody with war crimes and using, but in terms of actually these norms, I think we've only done nationality jurisdiction, passive or active, so.
because the CWC, or the Chemical Weapons Convention, is a prohibitive convention, not a.
That's a penal,
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not like the genocide convention that causes people to have to do something, but it has worked in large measure for almost a century in generally keeping that terrible tool of war out of the combat zone. But you had moments and
I realize we're drawing dangerously close to our time, and I was thinking about we talked a lot about the intrinsic value of evidence and the different ways in which it serves to advance justice and restorative justice and other things. But I'd like for a moment to think about the instrumental value and how we take evidence and we use it to build political will. In some ways, I wish I had invited someone from a public relations firm or a Hollywood director or someone who can help us take those terabytes and somehow turn it into political will. And more specifically, I'd like us to think about some of the lessons we might have learned over the last 10 years coming out of the Caesar report and to what extent those lessons can be applied to what's happening in Ukraine right now, and how we can avoid a similar situation where 10 years from now, we're hosting an event on time and distraction with respect to Ukraine.
Media plays an important role in atrocity accountability. In fact, it's as important as anything that we do. If you have the media interested, emotional about it, then it's being read by people who can get emotional and focused on it as well. But when they walk away from something, it really takes the air out of the room, because the bottom line is nobody's reading about it. And in this busy world that we're in Ohio or Minnesota or in Bern, Switzerland, people just move on. There's your distraction problem. And so it's really critical that the media, in fact, assist us in almost a public relations way to keep it on the table.
Well, you need the immediate follow-up. You need to, when you walk out of that room, there's someone with a little card that's got a QR code that says, scan this and send an email to your representative right now, because they're never more engaged than the moment they walk out of that room. By the time they go home, have dinner, sit down, deal with everything that life throws at you, it doesn't change their level of, I want to do something about this. But then they're finding the time. It's the immediacy problem that you've got to solve when you have those kinds of tools.
Oh, Tina? Oh, sorry, Anna, go ahead and then we'll.
Very briefly, I think, yes, there has to be pressure all the time, and civil society organizations play a paramount role in providing that pressure. And at the global scale, I think we arrived at the point where the global mechanism of accountability needs to change. It's just a matter of time, but it needs to change, including the format of the United Nations. In addition, it's amendments of the Rome Statute and aligning functions, aligning procedures for atrocity crimes before the International Criminal Court. There is an initiative already, and this initiative is supported by large groups of international lawyers at national and global levels. Germany, if I remember correctly, lead the initiative. However, we arrived at the point where the Rome Statute needs to be ratified together with Kampala amendments by countries who have not done yet, so including Ukraine, which is in the process now. And procedures before ICC need to be aligned so that ICC can review the crime of aggression for the future.
Michael, sorry to interrupt you. We did have some questions.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Could I turn to Tina and then we'll take a couple questions online? Thanks.
I have a few points I'll just quickly try to get through. I think with regards to, as an NGO working with policymakers, something that Syria often struggles with is that governments are often having Middle East bureaus or Near Eastern bureaus. And so when you're talking about distraction, Syria, especially right now, is often at the bottom of the list. So it's also on human rights defenders or NGOs and civil society to keep bringing that up, but also on, I think, governments to think through how they're prioritizing entire regions. I think that's one thing that I would mention. I think also a lesson that we've learned from Syria is that individual mechanisms, a potential commission, will not substitute for a broader strategy or political will. So we have now the double INP, the triple IM, we have UNITAD, we have universal jurisdiction cases, potentially a chemical weapons investigative mechanism, that none of that is going to substitute for a larger comprehensive transitional justice idea with regards to Syria, whatever that looks like, one driven by the Syrian people. And the last thing I'll say with regards to evidence, Sahid, your question on when individuals are exaggerating evidence, I think that's where evidence is also really instrumental, because survivors should often be driving, of course, prosecutions, and testimony should be the center of that, but that's where supplemental evidence comes in to prove the facts. To set the narrative straight. And that's where war crimes units also need to be trained to identify where exaggeration may be happening. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, we should just be centering survivors. I mean, even with the Caesar photos, I encourage everybody to look at the Caesar Family Association, where they have put forth demands to have the remains that have not been met. They have put forth demands to have the rest of the photos. Yeah, I'll just end with that.
That's great. So I want to beg the forgiveness of our friends and colleagues online. I don't have access actually to who's asking the questions, but maybe Taylor, you could. What's
Yeah,
that?
I'm happy to read them. Is that weird?
So they're doing them in the chat room.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so please go ahead.
Sure, yes. So these are submitted anonymously, but the first question, and a few of these may have been addressed to some degree already, but I'll let everyone elaborate as they see fit. So do you see a role for entities like the Register of Damages for Ukraine, the Council of Europe, in the documentation of evidence for war crimes? It would not be as comprehensive, but it could be better situated so as not to replace actual accountability. What are other entity examples and what else can be done? And the second question was directed specifically at Wes, but I'm sure others will have contributions as well. When it comes to atrocity prevention, is there a real-time analysis that continues for places like Yemen, Syria, and Ukraine, so that even if that is not relevant to immediate accountability, this information helps inform approaches to what happens quote, after the fact? I hope that this makes sense. So those are the two questions from the audience that we'll let everyone address as they see fit.
I can answer the second one pretty quickly. We're working to stand that kind of thing up. So for example, the Ukraine Conflict Observatory, which is collecting information in real time using commercial satellite imagery and other forms of OSINT or open source intelligence information, that has become a massive part of this. We're not just relying on cloak and dagger human intelligence to get the key report out, or even what Caesar went through of getting those out. People are posting this themselves. Offenders are putting this on social media, are putting this into Telegram and Signal and other places like that. So collecting that information is important. It is important to note, however, that the skill set that is involved in perhaps looking at satellite imagery and determining, is that a burnt out building? Is that a mass grave? Is that a mobile artillery unit that's been moved to right outside a civilian population or something, is different from the skill set needed for perhaps post ceasefire of monitoring and ensuring that compliance is happening. So you can't just take one team and turn it into the other. Like the people who are doing the satellite imagery analysis for one can't immediately turn around and say, okay, can we track our humanitarian assistance convoys getting to the people they're supposed to be, or are they being interrupted? That's a different skill set. And so we are trying to stand up on capacity on that. We also have the Sudan Conflict Observatory. There's some efforts in way to look at conflict observatories for other conflicts and regions that I can't go into details on. I will say these are not cheap. And it's not actually the satellite imagery that's the problem. It's the salaries and the support networks and the systems that actually become really expensive, especially for long-term engagement. So it requires an investment by countries to engage in that, which can then, yes, be used for things like accountability afterwards. That evidence is processed in such a way that it can be used by a prosecutor later on.
Speaking of time, I'm afraid we've run out of it. What I would do is just quickly, if we could just go around, and if anybody has any closing remarks, you can pass as well. But if there's anything really important you'd like to say, then I'll turn it over to David for 1 minute, and then I'll just close us out. So if there are any parting remarks.
Thank you for pulling us
thank you for being here, all of you. David, you helped to inspire this session. Is there anything you'd like to say before I close out?
Let's continue to talk, work together, and let's continue the discussion perhaps in follow-on series of this particular. There's so many spin-off issues that we've discussed in general here, and I've been jotting down potential more specific meetings together with this group and others that can join us about this, so that we can always keep this dialogue going in a way that keeps the conversation going.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, certainly atrocities are not going away, time's not going away, and distractions not going away. So
If anything, they're
increasing, yeah. So it might be worth reconvening under this theme in the future. So yeah, watch this space. And I just want to say thank you to all those who joined us online as well. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.